There is still a man in France who carries the title Prince Napoleon. He has no palace, no government, no army, and no legal claim to rule the French Republic. Yet he's treated as the symbolic head of the old imperial household, and he's sometimes invited to official ceremonies by the very state that replaced his family's empire. That alone would have seemed impossible in the summer of 1815. Napoleon had just lost everything. His brothers had been kings. His sisters had ruled or married into princely houses. His wife had been an empress. His small son had been born to inherit an empire. Within months, the family was scattered across Europe and America. Some were watched by police. Some lived under borrowed titles. One former king built a new life in New Jersey. Napoleon's only legitimate son grew up in Vienna as an Austrian prince and died before he could return to France. And yet, the Bonapartes didn't disappear. In fact, one member of the next generation would eventually bring the family back to power and create another French empire. So what became of Napoleon's family after his empire fell? To understand the scale of the reversal, it helps to remember what Napoleon had turned his relatives into. The Bonapartes had begun as a relatively modest Corsican family. By the height of the First Empire, Napoleon had tried to make them into a European dynasty. His older brother Joseph became king of Naples and later king of Spain. His younger brother Louis became king of Holland. His youngest brother Jérôme became king of Westphalia. His sister Caroline became queen of Naples through her marriage to Joachim Murat. Elisa became Grand Duchess of Tuscany. Pauline married into the Borghese family and became an Italian princess. Their mother, Letizia, was given the formal dignity of Madame Mère, the emperor's mother. This was more than family favoritism. Napoleon was trying to solve a political problem. He'd created a new imperial system in a continent still dominated by old dynasties. If he wanted that system to survive him, he needed loyal rulers, marriages, heirs, and a family network that could turn military conquest into something permanent. The problem was that the Bonapartes weren't pieces on a chessboard. Joseph resented being blamed for Spain. Louis tried to rule Holland in ways that suited the Dutch rather than his brother. Lucien had already clashed with Napoleon over politics and marriage. Caroline and Murat tried to protect their own throne in Naples when Napoleon's position weakened. Jérôme could be loyal, but he could also be expensive, impulsive, and difficult to control. Napoleon had raised his family higher than almost any Corsican clan could have imagined. But he'd also tied nearly every one of them to his own military success. When that success failed, their thrones failed with it. The first great break came in 1814. Allied armies entered France. Napoleon abdicated and was sent to Elba. For the imperial family, this wasn't simply the defeat of one man. It was the collapse of the system that had created their titles. Even then, the story wasn't finished. Napoleon returned from Elba in 1815, reclaimed power during the 100 Days, and forced Europe to confront him again. Several members of his family watched closely. Some tried to help. Jérôme fought in the campaign that ended at Waterloo. Then came the final defeat. Napoleon abdicated again on June 22, 1815. He would eventually be sent to St. Helena, far out in the South Atlantic. In January 1816, the restored French government formally banished members of the Bonaparte family from French territory. That rule explains much of what happened next. The family's problem was no longer simply that they'd lost royal titles. Their very name had become politically dangerous. A Bonaparte in France could become a rallying point. A child could become a claimant. A former king could become the center of a conspiracy. The restored monarchy didn't need every Bonaparte actively plotting. It only needed to fear what the name might inspire. So the family scattered. The most important person was also the youngest. Napoleon's legitimate son, Napoleon François Charles Joseph, had been born in Paris in 1811. His birth had been announced with cannon fire. He'd been given the title King of Rome. He wasn't merely a child Napoleon loved. He was the answer to the central dynastic question of the empire. Napoleon finally had an heir. But the boy's life after the collapse shows just how completely the meaning of the Bonaparte name changed. In 1814, after Napoleon's first abdication, The child was taken to Austria with his mother, Marie-Louise. Napoleon never saw either of them again. After Waterloo, he tried once more to abdicate in favor of his son. In Bonapartist memory, the boy became Napoleon II. Politically, however, the attempt failed. The chambers in Paris didn't place the child on the throne, and the victorious powers had no intention of allowing Napoleon's dynasty to continue. The boy who'd been born as the future of the French Empire now grew up at the court of his Austrian grandfather. That was a remarkable reversal. His mother was an Austrian archduchess by birth, the daughter of Emperor Francis. Her marriage to Napoleon had been a diplomatic union between the Habsburg dynasty and the man who had repeatedly defeated Austria. Once Napoleon fell, Marie-Louise's life moved back toward the world she'd come from. The Congress of Vienna made her Duchess of Parma. She entered Parma in 1816 and ruled there for the rest of her life, while Napoleon remained a prisoner on St. Helena. Her son didn't go with her to rule Parma. He stayed in Vienna. In 1818, he was given the title Duke of Reichstadt. He was educated as an Austrian prince and entered the Austrian military world. To French Bonapartists, he remained the emperor's son. To the Habsburg court, he was a young relative whose political meaning had to be carefully contained. Imagine the strange identity forced upon him. He was born in the Tuileries as the heir to Napoleon. His childhood title had linked him to Rome and the future of a continental empire. Yet as he grew older, he lived at Schönbrunn, wore an Austrian uniform, and answered to a title drawn from Habsburg lands. His father became a legend while the son remained far from France. Napoleon died on St. Helena in 1821. From that moment, the young Duke of Reichstadt became even more important to Bonapartist hopes. The idea of Napoleon could now be separated from the failures of the living emperor. Veterans remembered the old campaigns. Admirers romanticized the lost age. Opponents of the restored order could imagine a future built around the name. But the heir never got the chance to test any of those hopes. He developed tuberculosis and died at Schönbrunn Palace on July 22, 1832. He was only 21. He'd never married and left no children. For Napoleon's direct, legitimate line, that was the end. The empire had been designed around hereditary succession. The long-awaited son had survived his father by 11 years, but the dynasty Napoleon had personally tried to found through him didn't continue. That could have ended the Bonaparte political story. Instead, it shifted the importance of the name to Napoleon's brothers and their children. Joseph Bonaparte's path could hardly have been more different from his nephew's. Joseph had once worn 2 crowns. Napoleon first made him King of Naples, then moved him to Spain. His Spanish throne became one of the most painful symbols of the Napoleonic system. Large parts of Spain resisted him. British intervention and the brutal Peninsular War made his reign increasingly impossible. By 1813, Joseph had been forced out. After Waterloo, he faced a new question. Where does a former king go when he's not welcome in the country of his own family? Joseph chose the United States. He crossed the Atlantic and created one of the strangest afterlives of any fallen European monarch. In America, he often used the name Count de Servilliers. He bought an estate near Bordentown, New Jersey, called Point Breeze. The contrast was extraordinary. The man who'd sat on the throne of Spain now lived as a wealthy private gentleman beside the Delaware River. Point Breeze wasn't a hut of exile. Joseph had escaped Europe with substantial resources. The estate grew into a grand property filled with art, books, furniture, and the habits of a man who'd once lived in royal courts. Its landscaped grounds stretched over a vast area. Visitors encountered paintings, sculpture, gardens, carriage roads, and a European style of aristocratic life transplanted into the American Republic. And that's what makes Joseph's story more interesting than a simple fall from riches to poverty. He lost kingship, but he didn't lose everything. In the United States, he could live without a throne and still preserve status, culture, wealth, and a circle of influence. He entertained prominent Americans. He became a familiar figure among French exiles. Plans and fantasies occasionally circulated around the Bonaparte name, including schemes involving political opportunities in the Americas. But Joseph never became king again. For roughly 17 years, the former King of Spain lived in the United States. He eventually returned to Europe and died in Florence in 1844. His American life revealed a pattern that would repeat across the family. The old imperial titles often disappeared. Private identity didn't. Wealth might shrink, move, or change form. Political power could vanish while social standing survived. Other Bonapartes had much harsher transitions. Lucien Bonaparte had always been an unusual case. He'd helped Napoleon seize power in the coup of 18 Brumaire, but later resisted his brother's control. His marriage choices angered Napoleon, and he spent much of the imperial period outside the central family system. The Pope made him Prince of Canino. That distance from Napoleon didn't make the final collapse easy. After 1815, Lucien returned to Italy and lived under restrictions in the Papal States. He wrote, worked on his memoirs, and tried to manage a large family. Money became a serious concern. He sold paintings and rented out property. This was another kind of status inversion. A man once close to the creation of Napoleon's government now had to think about the financial value of his art collection and the cost of maintaining his household. Lucien died near Viterbo in 1840, leaving a large number of children. His branch of the wider Bonaparte family continued, but it wasn't the branch that would eventually carry the central dynastic claim. Napoleon's sisters also discovered that the end of empire didn't produce one common fate. Elisa had been Grand Duchess of Tuscany. She'd governed with real energy, supported art and administration, and developed a court that reflected her imperial rank. When Napoleon's system collapsed, her political world disappeared with it. She was forced into exile in 1814. After Napoleon's return from Elba, the Austrian authorities treated her with even greater suspicion. She spent a period under house arrest and was eventually allowed to move to Trieste. She died in 1820, only 43 years old. Pauline's fall looked different. She'd been famous for beauty, style, and her marriage to Prince Camillo Borghese. Of all Napoleon's siblings, she was the one who visited him during his first exile on Elba. After the final collapse, she lived in Italy. Her only son from her first marriage had already died young, so her own line didn't become a route for imperial succession. Pauline died in 1825. Then there was Caroline. Caroline Bonaparte hadn't merely been Napoleon's sister. Through her husband, Joachim Murat, she'd become Queen of Naples. She was ambitious, politically aware, and determined to preserve the position of her own household. As Napoleon weakened, Murat and Caroline tried to save their throne. Their choices made them look disloyal to Napoleon at certain moments and unreliable to his enemies at others. It was a dangerous place to stand. In 1815, Murat tried to regain power in Naples. He was captured, tried, and executed by firing squad on October 13th. Caroline was now not only a fallen queen. She was a widow whose husband had been shot after the collapse of the world that had made them royal. She moved to Austria and lived under surveillance. Only after Napoleon's death in 1821 did the pressure ease enough for her to settle in Florence. She used the title Countess of Lapona, a name formed as an anagram of Napoli. That small detail says a great deal. The kingdom was gone. The title of queen was gone. But even in private life, Naples remained folded into her identity. Her children carried the family story in another direction. Two of her sons, Achille and Lucien Murat, moved to the United States during the 1820s. The next generation was already spreading the Napoleonic family network far beyond the courts that had created it. Their mother died in Florence in 1839. The oldest member of the family, their mother Letizia, experienced the collapse in yet another way. She'd known the Bonapartes before the crowns, before the palaces, and before the imperial court. Napoleon's rise had transformed her from the widowed mother of a financially fragile Corsican household into Madame Mère, the mother of an emperor whose children ruled across Europe. After the final defeat, she went back to Rome. From there, she tried unsuccessfully to obtain permission to join Napoleon on St. Helena. The distance between them became permanent. When news of his death reached her in 1821, she remained in Rome, living at the Palazzo Rinuccini and surrounded by the surviving family until her own death in 1836. Her life almost contained the entire Bonaparte story by itself. She'd seen the family flee Corsica with little security. She'd seen one son crown himself emperor and place siblings on European thrones. Then she'd seen those children return to Italy and Central Europe as exiles and former rulers. The family had risen together. Now it gathered in fragments. The Bonapartes were becoming a family of former rulers, exiles, private citizens, and descendants. But one branch was about to change the story completely. That branch came through Louis Bonaparte. Louis had once been King of Holland. His reign showed the limits of Napoleon's family system even before the empire fell. Louis tried to act as a Dutch king rather than simply as Napoleon's agent. That created repeated conflict between the brothers, and he abdicated in 1810. After the fall of the empire, Louis lived mainly in Italy. His marriage to Hortense de Beauharnais had been unhappy, and the family was often separated. Hortense, the daughter of Napoleon's first wife Josephine, settled near Lake Constance in Switzerland with her youngest surviving son. That son was Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. At first, he looked like another child growing up in the ruins of the imperial project. He'd been born in Paris in 1808, during the height of his uncle's power. After 1815, he spent much of his youth outside France. He studied in Switzerland, absorbed the legend of Napoleon, and slowly came to believe that the family name still had a political future. The death of Napoleon II in 1832 made that question more urgent. Who now represented the Napoleonic idea? Joseph had no sons. Louis still lived, but he was older and politically inactive. Lucien's line stood outside the main dynastic order Napoleon had designed. The young Louis Napoleon increasingly became the figure around whom Bonapartist hopes gathered. He wasn't content to wait. There was another sign that the Bonaparte story was changing from a living government into a political memory. Napoleon had written a detailed will on St. Helena. He couldn't leave his son an empire, because there was no empire left to inherit. Instead, he tried to pass on money, personal objects, obligations, and a political memory. His son was meant to receive many of the possessions that remained from his father's final years. Even that inheritance became complicated. Napoleon's money and bequests were tied up for years in legal and financial disputes. His son was the natural heir, but the young Duke of Reichstadt lived under Austrian control. Some objects intended for him weren't simply handed over. After the young man died in 1832, parts of that material were divided among surviving Bonaparte relatives. The story of the will is revealing because it shows what empire had become. Once, Napoleon had distributed kingdoms. Now his family was dividing objects. And the name itself was becoming more valuable than any crown he could still give them. In 1840, the French government of King Louis-Philippe agreed to bring Napoleon's remains back from St. Helena. Huge crowds watched the funeral procession in Paris before the coffin was placed at Les Invalides. The monarchy that ruled France hadn't restored the Bonapartes. It had restored Napoleon's body. That distinction mattered. A dead Napoleon could be turned into national history. A living Bonaparte could still become a political rival. The ceremony helped prove that the memory of the empire had survived the empire itself. Veterans, admirers, writers, artists, and ordinary spectators could remember Napoleon in ways that no government completely controlled. Louis Napoleon watched that changing political landscape carefully. He'd failed twice as a conspirator. But the return of his uncle's remains showed that the Bonaparte name still had emotional force inside France. The next time he entered French politics, he wouldn't come with a small band of soldiers. He would come with votes. In 1836, he tried to trigger a military uprising at Strasbourg. It failed almost immediately. He was sent away and eventually reached the United States before returning to Europe when his mother became seriously ill. Then, in 1840, he tried again at Boulogne. That attempt also failed. This time, the French state imprisoned him for life at the fortress of Ham. If the Bonaparte story had ended there, Louis Napoleon might have been remembered as a stubborn relative living inside his uncle's legend. Instead, he escaped. In May 1846, disguised as a laborer, he walked out of Ham and made his way to London. Only weeks later, his father Louis died in Livorno. For Bonapartists, Louis Napoleon was now the head of the family and the central heir to the imperial political tradition. Then France changed. In February 1848, revolution overthrew King Louis Philippe and created the Second Republic. The very political system that had kept Louis Napoleon outside France suddenly opened a path back in. He was elected to the National Assembly. Then, in December 1848, the French people elected him president of the Republic by an overwhelming margin. Think about the reversal. 33 years after Waterloo, a Bonaparte was once again the elected head of the French state. The family name that had been treated as a danger had become an electoral asset. Louis Napoleon understood something Napoleon's defeated siblings hadn't been able to use in 1815. The empire had disappeared, but its memory hadn't. To some French voters, Napoleon represented order, military glory, national greatness, administrative achievement, and a heroic age. Different people remembered different parts of the legend. Louis Napoleon offered himself as the man who could inherit all of them. In December 1851, he carried out a coup and dismantled the constitutional limits on his presidency. 1 year later, the Second Empire was proclaimed. Louis Napoleon became Napoleon III. The Bonapartes were imperial again. This was the greatest reversal in the family's entire post-Waterloo history. Napoleon's legitimate son had died in Vienna. His brothers and sisters had grown old in exile. The Bourbon monarchy that had banned the family had fallen. The July monarchy that followed it had fallen too. And now a nephew of Napoleon I sat on the French imperial throne. The Restoration transformed the lives of surviving Bonapartes. Jérôme, Napoleon's youngest brother, became the clearest human symbol of that comeback. After Waterloo, Jérôme and his wife Catherine of Württemberg had lived under the name Count and Countess of Montfort. They moved between Austria, Italy, and Rome. Their finances became difficult. Catherine died in 1835. Their daughter Mathilde's marriage to the wealthy Prince Demidov helped relieve some of Jérôme's money problems. For years, Jérôme had been a former king without a kingdom. Then the political weather changed. He was finally permitted to return to France in the late 1840s. When his nephew Louis Napoleon became president, Jérôme received major honors. He became governor of Les Invalides, then Marshal of France, and later president of the Senate under the new imperial regime. A man who'd been driven from his throne in Westphalia was now back at the center of public life in France. Jérôme died in 1860 and was buried at Les Invalides. The Bonaparte family had survived long enough to see its fortunes reverse twice. But the Second Restoration created a new problem. If the family had returned to power, could it keep power this time? Napoleon III tried to make the answer yes. He married Eugénie de Montijo, and in 1856 they had a son, the Prince Imperial. Once again, the Bonaparte system had a direct heir. Once again, the heir seemed to promise continuity. And once again, war destroyed it. In 1870, France went to war with Prussia. Napoleon III was captured at Sedan. His regime collapsed and the Third Republic was proclaimed in Paris. The Bonapartes were exiles again. Napoleon III settled with Eugénie and their son in England. He died there in 1873. For Bonapartists, the imperial future now rested on the young Prince Imperial. He grew up in Britain, trained as a soldier, and remained a focus for those who still believed the empire might return. But in 1879, while serving with British forces in southern Africa, he was killed in Zululand. He was 23 years old. That death changed the family succession yet again. Napoleon I's legitimate son was already dead without children. Napoleon III's only son was now dead without children. Joseph's male line hadn't carried the claim. Louis's direct imperial branch had ended. The dynastic inheritance moved to the descendants of Jérôme, the youngest Bonaparte brother. This is why the modern imperial household doesn't descend directly from Napoleon I. It descends from his brother. Jérôme's son, usually known as Prince Napoleon, had married Princess Clotilde of Savoy. Their son Victor became the main dynastic figure after the death of the Prince Imperial. When Victor died in 1926, the position passed to his son Louis. By then, The Bonaparte title had become something very different from what it had meant under Napoleon. France was firmly republican. There was no imperial government to inherit. The role was symbolic, dynastic, historical, and political only for the relatively small number of people who remained committed Bonapartists. Yet the French state still viewed former ruling families with caution. Prince Louis lived for years under a law that excluded members of families that had once ruled France. During the Second World War, he refused to allow the Bonapartist name to be exploited by occupying or collaborationist politics. He served under an assumed identity, joined the French resistance, and later served with French forces. That service mattered. The exile law was repealed in 1950. A Bonaparte could once again live openly in France without the old legal ban. By this point, the transformation was complete. In 1816, the family had been expelled because a Bonaparte on French soil looked like a threat to the restored monarchy. In the 20th century, a Bonaparte had fought for France while France was a republic. The family had survived by separating the name from the demand to rule. Prince Louis remained head of the imperial household until his death in 1997. His will created one final modern family dispute. Rather than place his elder son Charles at the head of the dynastic tradition, he designated his grandson Jean-Christophe. Charles didn't simply disappear from the story, and the succession has been described as disputed. But Jean-Christophe became the figure most often presented by the Bonapartist dynastic tradition as Prince Napoleon and symbolic head of the former imperial household. The title is a courtesy, carries no legal sovereignty over France. And Jean-Christophe hasn't positioned himself as a man preparing to seize a throne. That may be the most important change of all. The early Bonapartes survived by trying to preserve rank, money, marriage alliances, memory, and sometimes political possibility. The modern family survives because it no longer needs an empire in order to exist. Jean-Christophe was born in 1986. He built a professional life in business and finance rather than in government. His marriage came in 2019, when he married Olympia von Hohenzollern-Arco-Zinneberg. The historical symbolism was almost impossible to miss. Olympia descends from the Habsburg family. 2 centuries earlier, Napoleon had married the Austrian Archduchess Marie-Louise in an attempt to bind his new dynasty to one of Europe's oldest royal houses. Their son had grown up in Vienna after Napoleon's fall. Now a descendant of Jérôme Bonaparte married a descendant of the Habsburg world not as part of a treaty, but as a modern private marriage. Their religious wedding took place at Les Invalides in Paris, the great military complex where Napoleon I is buried. In December 2022, the couple had a son, Louis. So yes, the Bonaparte imperial line still has a next generation. But the phrase needs to be understood carefully. There's no French imperial succession recognized by the Republic. There's no legal throne waiting for a child to inherit. What survives is a family tradition, a name, a historical role, and a chain of memory that stretches back through Jérôme to the household Napoleon tried to turn into a dynasty. The question of money also changed across the generations. There was never one single Bonaparte fortune that passed intact from Napoleon to the modern family. The First Empire mixed personal property, imperial residences, state resources, titles, endowments, art, and estates in ways that could become very complicated once the regime disappeared. Different relatives entered the aftermath with very different resources. Joseph carried enough wealth to create Point Breeze. Lucien eventually sold art and rented property to meet financial needs. Jérôme's finances became strained enough that his daughter's marriage brought real relief. Marie-Louise kept Parma because the victorious powers gave her a new legal position there, not because Napoleon's French crown property followed her into exile. That's why asking whether the Bonapartes kept Napoleon's fortune produces the wrong picture. They kept pieces. Some relatives kept private wealth. Some kept jewelry, art, papers, family possessions, or property. Some lost heavily. Some married into other wealthy houses. Later generations inherited a mixture of private assets and extraordinary historical objects, while many major Napoleonic sites and collections became part of public institutions. The greatest inheritance wasn't a bank account. It was recognition. That recognition could be politically dangerous in the 19th century, commercially valuable in later generations, and emotionally complicated for descendants who had to live under one of the most famous surnames in European history. And that brings us back to the biggest question in this story. What did Napoleon's family actually lose? The obvious answer is crowns. Joseph lost Spain. Louis lost Holland. Jérôme lost Westphalia. Caroline lost Naples. Elisa lost Tuscany. Napoleon's son lost the future he'd been born to inherit. But the deeper loss was a system. Under Napoleon, family identity and political office had become fused. Being his brother could make a man a king. Being his sister could make a woman a grand duchess or queen. Marriage could become a tool of continental strategy. A child's birth could trigger cannon fire because the child represented the continuity of the state. After 1815, those links broke. A Bonaparte could still be rich, titled, admired, feared, watched, or politically active. But the name no longer automatically created a country to rule. That's why the family's post-imperial lives look so different. Joseph translated kingship into private wealth and social prestige in America. Lucien lived as an Italian prince and writer while managing financial pressure. Elisa died after exile and confinement. Pauline remained a princess through marriage but no longer a member of a ruling French imperial system. Caroline became a widowed former queen under Austrian watch. Jérôme wandered, struggled, returned, and eventually stood beside his nephew's restored empire. The next generation did something more radical. Louis Napoleon turned memory back into power. For a time, it worked. Then 1870 proved that even a restored dynasty couldn't escape the political forces transforming Europe. After that second collapse, the family gradually learned a different form of survival. Not restoration, adaptation. The palaces of the First Empire didn't remain private Bonaparte kingdoms. Many objects linked to Napoleon and his relatives entered museums, state collections, archives, and national memory. The family's political authority vanished, but the historical market value and cultural power of the name only grew. Napoleon himself became larger in memory than he'd been in ordinary family life. That created a strange inheritance for his relatives. To carry the name Bonaparte could open doors, attract attention, and connect a person to one of the most studied figures in modern history. But it could also reduce every descendant to a question about a man who died long before they were born. The family survived the empire, but it never escaped Napoleon's shadow. Even their burial places show that. Joseph, the former king of Spain who spent years in New Jersey, is buried at Les Invalides. Jérôme, the former king of Westphalia who lived through exile and return, is there too. Napoleon II, who died in Vienna without ever ruling France in practice, was eventually transferred to Les Invalides in the 20th century. The family that had been scattered after Waterloo was, in death, partly gathered again around Napoleon. And yet, the most striking evidence of survival isn't a tomb. It's the fact that the family still exists outside one. Today, Jean-Christophe, Prince Napoleon, represents the dynastic branch descending from Jérôme. His position has symbolic meaning, not governing power. France is a republic. The imperial household is a historical family institution, not a state. His young son Louis belongs to another generation, born more than 2 centuries after Napoleon crowned himself emperor of the French. That child doesn't inherit France. He inherits a name. And perhaps that's the final answer to what became of Napoleon's family. Napoleon tried to build a dynasty by giving his relatives kingdoms. Most of those kingdoms vanished almost as quickly as they'd been created. His own legitimate son died young and childless. His brothers and sisters were scattered, watched, widowed, financially pressured, or forced to rebuild private lives far from the courts they had known. For a few astonishing decades, the family name rose again. Napoleon's nephew became president, then emperor. Jérôme returned from exile to honors at the heart of the French state. A new Prince Imperial was born. Then that empire fell too. What survived wasn't the political structure Napoleon had designed. It was the family's ability to change shape. Kings became landowners. Queens became exiles. Princes became soldiers, writers, private citizens, businessmen, and keepers of memory. A dynasty built for conquest became a family living inside a republic. There's something almost perfectly Napoleonic about the final image. Walk into Les Invalides and Napoleon lies beneath the Great Dome, surrounded by the architecture of national memory. Nearby rest members of the family whose fortunes rose and fell with his own. Outside those walls, France has no emperor. The throne is gone. The kingdoms he gave away are gone. The laws that once expelled his relatives are gone too. But the name remains. And more than 200 years after Waterloo, that may be the most unexpected victory his family ever achieved.